Welcome! In this explainer, we are diving deep into a really provocative document. It's called Imperial Islam Hijacks the Original Islam. We're going to follow the source's own arguments piece by piece to explore a thesis that, honestly, challenges centuries of tradition. It claims history was rewritten, that a faith was redefined, so let's get right into it.
Wow. Okay. So the source does not ease us in, does it? It just drops this bombshell right at the start. The core idea is laid bare right away that a critical civil war didn't just wound the early Muslim community, it actually severed it from its original faith. It created a whole new version of Islam, born from that chaos. This one sentence really frames the entire document as a search for a lost truth.
And that quote leads us right here, to the central investigation of the source. It's not just making a bold claim for shock value, it's setting up a genuine historical search for what it calls the original Islam. The whole premise is that to really understand the faith as we know it today, you have to go back. You have to be a bit of a detective and pinpoint the exact moment that the path split.
Now, before we get into the history, the source introduces its framework, its lens for looking at all of this. It's a concept called BioIslam. And it's important to understand this isn't presented as a new religion or a sect. It's a methodology. The source makes this direct comparison to science. Just like science uses empirical methods to figure out the physical world, BioIslam is proposed as a method to try and discover truth in the spiritual world.
And here is the key assumption that makes this whole methodology tick. According to the source, BioIslam completely reframes the very idea of revelation. It argues that divine truth isn't some one-time event from the distant past, delivered only by prophets. No, instead, it suggests that the divine is always revealing itself. And here's the kicker, that modern science is one of the main ways that's happening right now.
So, this core idea that truth can be found in more than one place is what allows the source to set up its central conflict. It creates this stark contrast, this dichotomy between two opposing versions of Islam. And this is really the heart of the whole argument.
This slide just lays it out so clearly. On the left, you've got original Islam. The source claims this came from direct revelation, its essence was spiritual truth, but now it's been buried by history. Then, on the right, you have Imperial Islam. The argument here is that this version didn't come from revelation at all. It came from the stories written by the winners of those civil wars. Its purpose wasn't spiritual, it was political, to create social glue for a new empire. And its legacy? Well, that became what we now call traditional Islam.
And let's be really clear about what the source means by traditional Islam. It's not a critique of an individual's personal faith, not at all. It's talking about the official scholarly structures of both Sunni and Shia Islam. The text argues that this is a constructed narrative, one that was deliberately engineered, mixing fact with fiction. And why? The goal was purely practical, to create a unifying story, a mythology, that could hold together a massive multicultural empire that was built on conquest and still shaking from civil war.
To make this idea stick, the source draws a really powerful parallel to classical philosophy. It brings up Plato's concept of the noble lie, a myth knowingly created by the elites to keep society stable and under control. The document applies this idea directly to the early Islamic scholars, the ulama, suggesting they built a theological and historical framework that, while it might have contained truths, was ultimately a functional myth designed for imperial stability.
So, if this noble lie was so necessary, what was the crisis that made it so? Well, the source points to one specific, incredibly chaotic period as the trigger for this whole transformation. And that brings us to the historical core of the argument, the devastating civil wars that literally tore the early Muslim community apart.
The source's focus is laser sharp. It's all about the first 60 years after 632 CE. This was the foundational period, right? When leadership was being forged and the community was expanding at this unbelievable speed. But according to this document, this wasn't some golden age of unity. It was an era defined by massive political chaos and brutal internal fighting.
And to really put a number on that chaos, the source points to a pretty shocking figure. Out of those first 60 formative years, a staggering 19 of them were spent in civil war. Think about that. For nearly 1/3 of this foundational era, the community wasn't fighting outsiders, it was at war with itself.
And this bar chart gives us such a powerful visual of that reality. You see the years of peace and expansion right next to the years of internal warfare. Seeing it laid out like this really hammers home the source's claim that civil war wasn't just a bump in the road. It was a defining feature of this absolutely critical period in history.
So those 19 years of war were dominated by two major conflicts, known in Islamic history as the fitnas, or tribulations. The first fitna was a brutal 5-year conflict, just about a quarter century after the Prophet's death. But it's the second fitna, a longer and more decisive 12-year war, that the source identifies as the real point of no return. This is the event it claims cemented the break from the original message, based on that old saying, right? That truth is always the first casualty of war.
So the second fitna ends in 692 CE. A victor has emerged, but the empire is fractured. So how do you unify it? This question brings us to the source's main body of evidence, where it lays out a step-by-step case for how a new official narrative was systematically built over the next couple of centuries.
The argument is basically this. What followed the wars wasn't just a return to faith. It was a massive construction project. And this project, it claims, unfolded over the next 200 years, from about 700 to 900 CE. During this time, the state and the scholars worked together, more or less, to write down and finalize a definitive version of Islamic history, law, and theology, that imperial mythology that would become traditional Islam.
Okay, this timeline is absolutely central to the source's argument, so let's walk through it together. Our starting point is 692 CE, right after the Civil War ends. The winners start these huge projects to unify the empire, building incredible mosques and, critically, standardizing the written Quran with vowel markings. Then you go forward almost 30 years to 720 CE. That's when the state sponsors the first official collections of hadith, the reported sayings and actions of the Prophet. Now start paying attention to the time gaps. In 767 CE, that's over 130 years after the Prophet's death, we see the death of Ibn Ishaq, who wrote the first major biography. And the source makes a big deal of the fact that his original work is now completely lost. The time gap gets even wider. We jump all the way forward to 870 CE. We're now almost 240 years after the Prophet. This marks the death of Imam al-Bukhari, whose collection of hadith is one of the most trusted in Sunni Islam. And finally, in 933 CE, a full 300 years after the events being described, al-Tabari, the author of the first comprehensive history of Islam, dies. So you see what the source is doing here. It presents this timeline as its smoking gun. The argument is that the foundational texts of traditional Islam weren't first-hand accounts at all. They were compiled, edited, and made official centuries later, in a completely different political world that was forged by those civil wars.
And it's really important to see how the source frames this. This timeline isn't just presented as a wild theory. It's positioned as an analysis built on solid historical data. The author includes a ton of footnotes that cite the accepted academic timelines for these dates and figures. The whole point is to present this thesis as a work of historical research.
So after laying out this really detailed historical case for a hijacked religion, the document doesn't just leave us there. It circles all the way back to the beginning, to its framework, to propose what it sees as a solution, a path back to what it calls the original truth. And here we are again, back at the foundational principle of BioIslam. If the historical texts of traditional Islam are, as the source argues, a constructed imperial narrative, then how can anyone possibly find the original Islam? Well, the answer it proposes is to just bypass that potentially distorted historical record. By embracing this idea that divine truth is also revealed through ongoing scientific discovery, you can access a form of revelation that is totally independent of human history.
So let's break down what this worldview really means. First, it assumes there's a single universal truth hidden behind the outer layers of all major religions. But then it makes this huge leap. It extends that idea to science itself. So, an undisputed scientific principle, like, say, the law of gravity, is seen as a form of divine self-disclosure, a revelation of how the universe actually works, and this provides a method for seeking truth that doesn't rely on ancient texts or historical stories, but on verifiable, universal laws of nature.
And that brings us to the final, really provocative question that this whole document is building towards. The argument we've just walked through presents a radical rethinking of history, and it all hinges on this dramatically expanded idea of what revelation is. So the essential question it leaves us with is this: if knowledge from science is accepted as a form of revelation, how might that fundamentally change our modern understanding of what faith even is? It's a question that just blurs the lines between the spiritual and the material, and it's a pretty fascinating thought to end on.